again, Phil, but just a very brief welcome to Phil and for joining us this evening and to giving us what's going to be, no doubt, a very interesting talk about Thailand's movie theatres and probably touching on other theatres in the region as well, in the immediate region. But we were saying, talking early on, was based in Chiang Mai, I think for 10 years or so, Phil, maybe 15 years, 10 or 15 years, based in the north of Thailand, but he's spent a lot of time in the region and done a lot of research on the movie theatres. So I think it'd be interesting to hear what he has to say, interested to see some of his clips as well. So I think on that note, Phil, I'll hand over to you. Phil will talk from between 30 to 45 minutes, somewhere in that period, and then we'll keep the questions until afterwards. But Phil, over to you, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Andrew, and everybody else who's in attendance today. It feels very distant, obviously, for obvious reasons, talking about this subject now, as I've been back in the States for the last year now, and haven't put much energy into my movie theater project. But prior to that, prior to the pandemic, I'd spent about 11 years running around Southeast Asia, mostly Thailand and Burma, with a very narrow mission of documenting as many old, what I call standalone movie theaters as I can possibly find. And this project, which I kind of informally titled the Southeast Asia Movie Theater Project, started while I was in graduate school at Chiang Mai University, getting a master's degree in sustainable development. The project started out as a sort of extracurricular hobby and quickly developed into what would become my thesis topic, and later a kind of somewhat mainstream curiosity for people in Thailand and Burma and elsewhere in the region. Yeah, and so I will talk about a little bit about this process and what I've seen and what I've learned, and share some photos with you. First off, I'm going to very shamelessly plug the book that I published out of all this work, which is called the Thailand's Movie Theaters, Relics, Ruins, and the Romance of Escape. And this is a kind of best of all my photography and writing in regards to movie theaters in Thailand. So I think there's more information on that later, but so this project for me started very accidentally almost. One day while exploring Chiang Mai, actually I wasn't even officially exploring, I was just riding my motorbike around town to a very, I had a destination in mind, but I took a roundabout way and happened to come across an old standalone movie theater, which was tucked away in a wet market. And this was a great surprise to me. I had not known it existed. I have always had a fondness for old movie theaters. There were dozens of them in my hometown growing up. I'm from Philadelphia. And I had fond memories of going to them as a child, but by the time I became an adult, they were all gone. So to find one now in my adoptive hometown of Chiang Mai was quite intriguing. So I took a photograph of it, and you know, just for the sake of taking a picture, with the intent of going back eventually and seeing a movie there. However, I waited about 6 months, and by the time I returned, I found that there was a rubble-strewn field where the movie theater once was. And so that was basically the beginning of this project. That was the genesis of it. I figured if this is what's happening to the movie theaters in Chiang Mai, then I wonder if the same thing is happening on a nationwide scale. And so I bought a camera and started roaming, exploring the country. Yeah, there's the genesis. But let's step back a bit and I'll talk a little bit about what I learned besides what I actually saw with my own eyes. And what I learned about old movie theaters in Thailand is Thailand has a very long history of cinema going. It has its first cinema was constructed in 1905 in Bangkok. And shortly thereafter, the popularity of this theater spread to other parts of the country and throughout the metropolitan Bangkok area. The early movie theaters were very much like what you're seeing on this photograph. They were kind of barn-like structures, almost exclusively made of exotic hardwoods. And while they look very, not very opulent to us today, I think at the time of their construction, these were somewhat prestigious buildings. First of all, because they brought a medium which was, for much of Thailand, brand new and exciting, as it was for much of the world at the time. But also because they were expensive undertakings. So this is one such example. There are not a whole lot of examples of these kinds of movie theaters remaining. The wooden movie theaters in Thailand were usually torn down in the mid-century decades, in the 60s, 70s, if they existed that long. And they were replaced with modern concrete movie theaters. Or they were not replaced at all. It depends on where. A great characteristic of Thai movie theaters in the pre-multiplex days was this wonderful artwork which would adorn the theater facades, advertising the films. This one's for the movie Kelly's Heroes. I'm not sure if it's a spaghetti western or no, or a macaroni combat as they call them. Italian-made war films based off of the likes of Where Eagles Dare and such. Anyhow, this was one such advertisement. And this theater, in particular, the Saha Papayon, was in the city of Songkhla in southern Thailand. It happens to be one of the few remaining wooden movie theaters still in existence. And there it is now, not very opulent anymore. Yet it's still there. It's now serving as a parking garage in Songkhla. And there has been a very small movement among the preservation community of Songkhla to in some way revive this building, at least if not as a cinema itself, then as a cultural center of some sort. But these things tend to be kind of tricky. So it's now just sitting there being used as a parking garage. There is one example of these early movie theaters which has been a successful renovation project, and that's this one. This is in the heart of old Bangkok in the Nang Leung market area. This is the Salachalan Theater, which was originally called the Nang Leung Theater, based on the name of the neighborhood it's in. It was built in 1918. And it is the oldest existing example of a purpose-built movie theater in all of Thailand. About, let's say, 6 or 7 years ago, a movement started led by the Thai Film Archive to try and renovate this theater and turn it back into a living museum with some mix of cinema function therein. The property is owned by the Crown Property Bureau, so it was a bit of a tricky negotiation process. But after the submission of a very detailed master plan for preservation and some good lobbying on the part of the Thai Film Archive and other cinema enthusiasts like myself and a bunch of other independent folks in Bangkok and the rest of the country, the project got underway, and the last I checked, it has been fully renovated. I don't think it has been open to the public yet. this was its look prior to renovations in about probably 2017. It's been very, very nicely renovated since then. The exterior has been completely cleaned up and the wood has been resealed and it looks fantastic, yet it's not quite open yet. Anyhow, this is what the old movie theaters were like throughout Thailand. They were wooden affairs and kind of shocking to most modern sensibilities, I would say. In 1932, Thailand got what you would consider its first movie palace, and that in the Salachalan. This theater was built out of funds from, again, the Crown Property Bureau. It was built by King Rama VII, King Prajadipal. He designated, I believe it was something like 200,000 baht out of the royal fund to build this theater in 1932 as an anniversary gift for the 150th anniversary celebration of the founding of the Chakri dynasty and Bangkok itself. It opened 1 year late in 1933, but to much fanfare, and for many years it was kind of the flagship movie theater of the country. It is where most major movies premiered, and around it, on the streets surrounding it, developed the movie theater supply industry for the whole country. This is where you could buy anything from a projector to a light bulb for a projector to movie posters that would need to be sent up to the provinces to advertise movies. The Salachalan was the epicenter of the cinema industry in Bangkok. Or I should, not the cinema industry itself, but the movie theater industry in particular. Today, it's still in operation. It doesn't screen movies that often. It is now basically home to a masked Thai dance troupe, and which I've never been to, so I have never had the pleasure. But it's still quite an opulent affair. It's in beautiful condition and well maintained. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to photograph the interior when I went there. Otherwise, you would see what a beautiful structure this really is. And this building kind of set the stage for what would come later across Thailand, where theater magnates and independent theater builders, independent business people throughout the country would vie for the most opulent building in town. On a slight aside, to demonstrate exactly how much worth and value was placed upon a lot of these movie theaters, the tickets for them often featured the building in a very prominent way. And the tickets, as you can see like this, they look like currency. And these cinemas were truly considered valuable items. This was the Salachalan. This was the Queen's Theater, also of Bangkok. The New Odeon, the premier theater for movies coming from the Chinese-speaking world, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, not so much mainland China for political reasons, but the other Chinese language producing countries. The Broadway Theater in Bangkok, also in the Chinatown area. The Empire Theater near Pak Klong Talat, also in Bangkok. This has been one of my side hobbies, is collecting these movie theater tickets. They're quite special. I haven't seen tickets from any other country that are quite as spectacular as the ones the Thais produced. Here was the Capitol Theater, also in Bangkok, once one of the premier movie theaters. I'm actually wearing a t-shirt, I don't know if you can see that, with the Capitol logo on it that I took directly from this ticket. Anyhow, so in my mind, the fact that the tickets were adorned with kind of an architectural representation of the theaters shows to me the importance of these buildings, at least in a symbolic way, for their owners and for the communities that they served. This one was from Chiang Mai, the Sortie Wong Cinema. The Sortie Wong, interestingly, it's no longer there, but it was built by a guy by the name of Jiao Chai Sortie Wong Na Chiang Mai. The name is interesting, and Na Chiang Mai indicates that they're of Chiang Mai royal heritage. And indeed, Jiao Chai Sortie Wong was from the Chiang Mai royal family. Throughout Thailand, there is a history of noble people being involved in the cinema industry, either actual members of the nobility or, in other cases, the major business families in various towns and cities. Another famous family that was involved in the cinema industry, particularly in Chiang Mai, was the Shinawatt family. The Shinawatts, Thaksin's father, owned 3 cinemas throughout Chiang Mai. It was one of his many sources of revenue. In nearly every town you go to, Phuket comes to mind, you will find the cinemas that were in existence were each owned by one of the Trakun Yais, or the big families. And this you find across the country. It was a prestige building. It also, if you think about it in a kind of more sociological perspective, the movie theater was a very important place in terms of information. So to be able to control the flow of information through the ownership of a movie theater, again, kind of fits in with this, the logic of ownership by VIP types. Moving forward, in the 1940s, Thailand is embroiled in World War II. The government at the time, run by Field Marshal Pibun Songkran, signs a treaty with the Japanese and joins the Axis powers. And during his reign, he elevates the military to a position of supremacy in the country. And in so doing, decides that he needs to promote the military. Well, what better way to promote the military than to show movies about the military? And in order to do this, he needs to build more movie theaters. So in the city of Lopburi, which at the time had the largest military base in the country, still does to my knowledge, Pibun Songkran allots some money for the construction of this beautiful, somewhat Bauhaus or Art Deco style movie theater, the Soldiers Theater, or the Tahan Bok. When it was originally opened in 1941, soldiers could go see films for free here, on the weekends only though. And this is one of at least 3 theaters throughout the country that Pibun Songkran had commissioned. There was another one in the city of Uthai Thani. This is the New Chalerm Uthai Theater. Still standing derelict in the middle of the old market. The most famous movie theater, however, built by the administration of Pibun Songkran was in Bangkok. And this theater used to stand at the head of Ratchadamnern Road. It was the Salachalan Thai Theater. Now, when this opened in 1949, it became the premier movie theater in the country for major films, both Thai and international. It was, by all accounts, the grandest movie theater ever built in Thailand, the most opulent and the most prestigious. at least during its heyday, which was in the 60s and early 70s. Unfortunately, it was torn down in I believe in the late 80s or maybe early 90s. It was torn down because its placement obscured the view of a very important temple. I can never remember the name of the temple, but it's on Ratchadamnern Road, and it was considered somewhat an inopportune place to put a movie theater, so it was torn down. And now there is a kind of open plaza where this theater once was. But some other important theaters of the time in Bangkok were the Queen in the Wang Burapha area, the Grand, also of Wang Burapha, and and there's another one that I don't have a picture of, the King. The King, the Queen, and the Grand were all in the center of the Wang Burapha neighborhood. They were built upon land which used to belong to a minor member of the nobility. A castle was there. And the castle was bombed during World War II by the Allies because it had become taken over by the Japanese and used as, I think, as a prison. It was bombed by the Allies. After World War II, a developer purchased the property and built these 3 theaters, the King, the Queen, and the Grand, all named appropriately to somewhat pay homage to the palace that once stood there. When this neighborhood, or when these theaters were developed, the Wang Burapha neighborhood became the in place in Bangkok if you were a young person. Around the 3 theaters, all kinds of restaurants and milkshake shops and clothing stores developed. And this was basically what would later be replaced by Siam Square. Prior to Siam Square's commercial supremacy, Wang Burapha was the place to be if you were young and in trend. I inserted this slide for a particular reason. It has to do with going back a few slides to the Salachalan Thai. This movie poster is the Thai poster for the film The Ugly American, starring Marlon Brando. The film was shot largely in Thailand, and it has a cameo appearance by Kukrit Pramod, who at the time was the prime minister. He plays the sovereign, he plays the king in the movie. And he has a bit role, but what I find funny about it is because of who he is, Kukrit is slightly higher than Marlon Brando in the Thai rendering of the poster. And the movie itself actually had its world premiere at the Salachalan Thai Theater with Marlon Brando in attendance. And somewhere out there, there's a picture of Marlon Brando grinning ear to ear, standing in front of the theater. I don't have it, unfortunately. But likewise, throughout the country, you have movie theaters being built. In the 1950s, you have a kind of late stage Art Deco type look to these movie theaters. Like this one here in the city of Ubon Ratchathani. I was given this picture by a US serviceman who was stationed at the Air Force Base in Ubon, who got his photo taken in front of this theater, the Chalem Sin movie theater. But what I want to illustrate more importantly than that is, see, here you have the look of the theater in the 1950s or early 60s when it was first built. And then as time went by and tastes changed architecturally, the owner of the building tried to modernize it by putting on this new facade and giving it a completely new look. This is the exact same building as the one you saw in the previous picture. You can see at the top, the signs just sticking up a little bit. Chalem Sin, the same sign on the top of the building there. And here it is a few years later with an even more opulent, grand, and modern sign. So you can, let's say, I enjoy studying architectural trends by looking at these photographs. You can see how things change over time. Again, more modernist movie theaters throughout the country. This theater was the Pha Mai in Nan province. When theaters came to provinces like Nan and Chiang Mai and remote places like that, they became extremely important for the, how do we say, for the dissemination of new ideas through film. A lot of these places were in many ways feudal still. Electricity was sparse well into the 1980s. So the movie theater was like access to another world for people who are from remote villages in distant parts of Thailand. Here's the Pitsanulok Rama 2. I believe there was a 1 that was located around the corner, and that was so successful that the owner built number 2. And here you can see on the film showing as on the marquee and the painted billboard is Sapan Narok, which is the Thai title for the movie A Bridge Too Far. So here's where I come in. What you were just seeing was photographs of pictures of movie theaters while they were still in operation. Then I started roaming the country and I found them in ghost-like abandoned conditions, but nonetheless still standing. And a lot of what I found is this mid-century modernist architecture of various kinds, like the Amarin Rama in Suwan Kalok, Sukhothai province, built in 1975, closed around 1997, and just kind of sitting rotting for many years until I think about 2012 it was demolished. I found it in 2009. What I found when doing this work is that a lot of the theaters closed, a lot of these standalone cinemas closed in 1997, which is a somewhat auspicious year. It was also the year of the great economic collapse, the Asian economic crisis, when finances became tight and the ability for struggling theater owners to get a loan to keep their business in operation vanished. And so many theaters also vanished. I guess I'm jumping around a bit. The Siam Theater, the Lido Theater, and the Scala were all the next evolution of movie theater in Thailand. After the Wang Burapa area, those three, the King, the Queen, and the Grand, the next area in Bangkok to develop around movie theaters was Siam Square. Siam Square was actually named after the Siam Theater. The Siam Theater was the first major institutional development in the area. The commercial streets around it followed the theater. The Siam was so successful that a few years later, the owners, the Shinawatt family, constructed the Lido Theater, which is still standing, although in a completely different guise now. It's been renovated and gutted and turned into something completely different. This became the epicenter of in-trend young Thais throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in my mind, it shows the importance of the cinema in kind of leading these trends. The Siam, it should be mentioned, was the first movie theater in the country equipped with Cinerama technology. This kind of grand curved screen that wowed audiences in the 1950s and 60s. Because of the popularity of Cinerama in Thailand and everyone noting that the Siam was the first location of it, when new theaters were built in the 60s and 70s elsewhere in the country, they would incorporate Rama into the name of the theater. So for instance, if it was a movie theater in Chiang Mai, it might be called the Chiang Mai Rama. If it was a movie theater in, let's say, Udon, it might be the Udon Rama. People have wondered, does that have something to do with the term Rama used for royalty, used for kings in Thailand? No. What that happens to be is the owners trying to gain some credibility from the Cinerama technology, even though they might not have actually had it installed in their own theater. But it was to denote a modern, up-to-date, cutting-edge movie theater. Here we have another famous movie theater in Bangkok, the Pet Rama, which actually did have Cinerama. It truly did. Any theater that actually has Cinerama, that logo on the facade, generally speaking, they did buy the rights to the technology, but a lot of them just took the title. Here is the Sakyorama in the city of Sakyo, outside about 6 or 7 hours outside of Bangkok to the east, sitting completely vacant in a somewhat jungle-like setting outside of the city. The Sam Suk Theater in a small town in Udon Thani province, Kumpawapi, classic example of mid-century modern architecture being applied to Thai movie theaters. Here is a famous one, or I should say infamous, the Bangkok Rama in the Bangkok section of Bangkok. When I visited this theater in about 2016, it was still in operation, albeit not as a regular movie theater. It had become a sort of a cruising theater, a den for illicit, or maybe not illicit, but let's just say sexual activity, deviant sexual activity. And so I set up my camera in front of the theater to take a picture, and immediately after doing so, somebody from the theater, a caretaker or a manager, comes running out and shoos me down. No, 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 you cannot take a photo of this. And I understood what was going on. But I said, hey, look, I'm not interested in the happenings of the theater. I'm really here just to document the building because they're disappearing. And this is one of the last remaining in the Bangkok area. And after pleading my case for a bit, he consented and allowed me to take the picture. While I was doing so, I inadvertently snapped a picture of a patron of the theater running as fast as he could away to avoid being photographed. And if you look at the bottom left corner, you can see a man in sprint position doing just that, running away to avoid capture. He will never be identified though, so lucky him. And sure enough, a few years later, this theater was completely demolished and there's nothing left. So I like to imagine this is one of the few photos of it in public domain. Again, here's another similar theater in southern Thailand, in Prachuap Khiri Khan province. Yeah, so on and on and on. This theater right here, the Siri Phnom Rama Theater in the town of Phnom Salachalan, Chaeng Sao province. Again, to show the connection between politics and the cinema in Thailand. As I was documenting this and getting some background information on it, I was informed that this theater is actually owned by an active member of parliament for national parliament for the province of Chaeng Sao. So in continuing with the great tradition of political big shots and cinema ownership. So both this, the Sili Phnom Rama, and ones like this, the Bang Pa In Rama in Bang Pa In district, Ayutthaya province, these were built in the very early 80s. And the 1980s marks the end of what I like to call the movie theater construction boom, which started in about 1961 It ends in about 1981. By this time, Thai society is changing very rapidly. The influx of automobiles is making movie theaters like this, which had hundreds, if not thousands of seats, but no secured parking spots, tenuous business propositions, I should say tenuous businesses in general. Because as more and more people are driving to do everything, there's no parking to go to a movie. And these theaters slowly started to lose customers until many of them lingered on into the 90s, some into the early 2000s. But slowly but surely, they've dwindled down to a last, I believe there's 2 operating standalone movie theaters in the entire country, 2 out of a total of some 700 that have been in existence over the years. The first movie city in Thailand, it was actually not in Bangkok. This was the Nevada Multiplex in Ubon Ratchathani. It was considered the first multiplex and started the trend of the multiplex shopping mall combination, which is basically all you find throughout Thailand these days. They're successful because for a number of reasons, but the main reason is that they provide secure, free parking for people to drive into, as opposed to trying to squeeze in on a tight urban center street where most of the old movie theaters were located. This picture right here represents one of the last 2 operating theaters, the Det Udom Mini Theater in a little town called Det Udom. That's outside of Ubon Ratchathani in the northeast Thailand. In talking to the owner, this is one of several businesses that he operates, and I don't think he makes any money off of it, but he likes to keep it open for the few remaining community members who still like to see movies on the big screen in a down-home atmosphere. So my hat goes off to him. Another of the few remaining, or the 2 remaining, is the Chum Phe Cineplex, also in northeast Thailand in the town of Chum Phe. This photograph was taken about, I want to say 7-8 years ago, but from what I understand, it is still in operation. Until about 7 months ago, maybe more than that now, until about 9 months ago, Bangkok laid claim to perhaps the most opulent, splendid movie theater left in Southeast Asia, standalone movie theater, the Scala Theater. I'm imagining that some of you have at least seen it before, if not seen a movie there. This was Thailand's last movie palace in the tradition of the Chalerm Krung and the Chalerm Thai. It was in the Siam Square area. It was built in 1969 at the height of Thailand's movie theater construction boom. And it represents, I would say, about the most ornate example of movie theater architecture that's still existing anyhow, or that was still existing in the region. I say was because it met a very unfortunate fate not too long ago. About 10 years ago, the property management company of the property management division of Chulalongkorn University, which owns the land that the Scala sits on, decided that it was going to raise the Scala, the Lido, and the Siam theaters to build a series of shopping malls, as if that area didn't need more shopping malls. There is a big outcry from preservationists and movie lovers, and it resulted in a kind of ad hoc preservation movement, which over the years gained steam. Going into 2019, it was announced that the theater's contract would expire in 2020, or was it maybe 2021? I can't remember. But at that point, this preservation movement really got ramped up, and there was dialogue with the university and some institutional backing for the idea of salvaging the movie theater and turning it into kind of Bangkok's epicenter of cinema culture. And this was going good. Then the pandemic hit, the theater shut down early, and the owner announced that they were not going to reopen. And at this point, everyone thought, oh, well, there goes the end of Scala as we know it, but at least it's got momentum towards this next phase. Sorry. Sadly, while the bidding process was going on with the university to find a new operator, the owners decided that they wanted to keep all of the parts of the theater. They wanted to remove all the ornamentation, all the valuable materials. In other words, they completely gutted the building, from signage to the chandeliers you're seeing here, these beautiful medallions in the ceiling, to all the marble and the artwork that's in the building, and left it a ghostly nightmare. And that's how it stands today. There's still a bit of a movement to try and find new use for it, but obviously in its condition, it would take a lot more money, and that makes it all the more daunting of a process. I don't have a picture of what it looks like now. It's too depressing. But mark my words, it is completely decimated, other than the structure itself. And that is sadly where I end my note for Thai movie theaters. I have some additional slides of movie theaters in Burma, where until the pandemic and subsequent military coup, Burma now can lay claim to some of the finest active movie theaters in Southeast Asia. Sadly, for Thailand, they gave away that position in the middle of last year. So I think I will leave it there. Yeah, there's my book. If you would like to follow my work, I put a lot of my stuff for view on Instagram under my name, Phil Jablon. I also have an account for my Thai movie poster collection. I collect vintage Thai movie posters. That's called Thai Poster Bliss. On Facebook, I have the Southeast Asia Movie Theater Project page. And I also have a blog. The blog is where most of my work goes. Most of my photography and writing goes on the blog, and that's also called the Southeast Asia Movie Theater Project. And if you want to waste many an hour looking at pictures of movie theaters and reading my drivel, that's where to go. So there you have it. I hope I haven't bored you all.
No, not at all, Phil. No, it's been very interesting, and I think it's good that someone like yourself was taken on this task, because I think if you hadn't, a lot of this history would have just disappeared, and nobody would be any the wiser. I mean, when you say that at one stage there were 700 of these theatres in the country, and now, I mean, there's two that you mentioned are still operational, but they're barely operational. I mean, they're almost all gone altogether. But I mean, it's sort of a part of Thailand's history that's almost completely faded away. And I think it's good that you've taken the trouble to actually carry out the work you have. You mentioned Burma. Did you go to any other countries in the region to see whether they also had any theatres, any active theatres or old theatres?
The three countries I've explored in depth in the region are Laos, Burma, and Thailand. Laos has nothing active, and it hasn't had anything active for a very long time. They do now have a few
Oh,
modern.
yeah, modern theatres. Yes, no, I can
Right.
see. You can see why it's moved in that direction, but it's a sort of it's a very interesting part of the history that without you going around and having catalogued what you have, I think it would have just disappeared without any trace. I mean, I think it's good that you've done this. There are people like you out there doing that. Andrews, any questions? I see Tom Waller's joined us. Phil, I don't know if you know Tom Waller, who's the director of the film The Cave. I don't know if the two of you have ever come across each other before.
No, but I know the name and the reputation.
I'm sure you
Nice to
know
meet you,
Tom's
Tom.
name if you haven't met him, but I'm sure. Well, Tom probably would know some of that history that you've just described. But I think it's good that he's come along. And he's part of the sort of the new wave of Thailand cinema and Thailand's cinema industry. But certainly, I found it very interesting. If you were there, Tom, thank you for joining us. I don't know if you got any questions to ask Phil, because you must have found that quite an interesting an account.
Yeah, hi Phil, it was fascinating. I mean, amazing that you've managed to record the history in such detail. You know, I was just, I don't actually have a copy of your book yet, but I'm certainly going to seek it out. And it's just so sad to see some of, you know, especially with the demise of Scala and what's happened to that. It's just so sad to see these cinemas fall away. So, you know, that we always make films for the cinema. It's the kind of cathedral of our art form, if you like. And, you know, even now films are destined mostly for the small screen, you know, with streaming and that taking over. So there's a kind of seismic shift in my industry anyway. But it's great to have recorded the history, and I can see you've done some wonderful research. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, it's been a lot of fun, I have to say. And thanks for your film, by the way. The Cave. I know.
Yes, no,
Yeah,
The Cave.
sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, well, you know, I will continue to make films whether they're watching them in the cinema or not. But obviously, whenever we try and, you know, when we turn the camera on, we're always hoping that someone will watch it on a fabulous screen in a lovely theater.
Absolutely. I mean, that brings up a good point in general about these theaters, not just in Thailand, but around the world, is where there is like you said, a seismic shift going on, and the future of movie theaters in general is in limbo. And I like to be an optimist about it and think there are definitely ways to keep them going, but it's going to take some deep thinking.
Well, it was interesting, Phil, when you mentioned that 1997 was a catalyst for actually doing away with a lot of the theatres, because you know, it was just that suddenly hit, and all of a sudden it wasn't economic to continue. So and now we've got a similar sort of economic catastrophe through the virus. But you can see that that's going to have an impact, and that's going to take a while for people to get back on their feet again as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is a shame. But I mean, hopefully that won't be lost, and gradually we'll see everything returning to normal. I think we're beginning to see that in the UK. We've been through the ringer for the last 6 to 12 months, but fortunately, through the vaccination program, things are beginning to pick up here, which is beginning to get live audiences back on a small scale. But it's beginning to happen again, and hopefully the theatres and the cinemas will begin to get open again. Because otherwise, the longer they're out of action, the more likely the likelihood is there'll be fewer of them around at the end of it.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately. Suzette, did that bring back any memories from Singapore? You started off telling us about sitting around the kampong watching.
Well, yes. I mean, no, well, not quite the kampong. We had an open air, but I also went indoors. There was indoors. It's not so much open air, but no, it was, they look really nice, those buildings, and it's a shame about Scala. So I know, yeah. And the names, the like Capital and Lido, they seem to be sort of like Asian names, because I remember our cinemas being called that as well.
Similar sort of names.
Yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
The Rex and the Roxy and Capitol.
Yeah, no, I think we all had some of those many years ago.
Yeah,
But,
no, that was wonderful, very interesting, and I'm looking forward because I volunteered at Arts Centre in Maidenhead, Northern Farm, and we're opening on Monday, and we've got to go in and with our full PPE stuff and seats and so it'll be interesting. Yeah,
indeed.
No, it's good. Bring back live theatre and everything. It's
gradually, yeah. It's beginning to come back at last. So, but having your talk on the back of that, Phil, is just interesting to see the demise of what used to be and what led to this sort of the acceleration of the demise, as I say, being the downturn in '97, the regional downturn, which was very sad. Anyone else got any questions? Andrew, have you got any?
I haven't got anybody waving, Steve. No.
Points you'd like to raise? If not, I think you've done a very good job of promoting your book. I was going to do that as well, but I mean, as I say, if anybody wants to follow up, as Tom has suggested, to get a copy of Phil's book, please go ahead and do so. How are you managing to keep up your interest now? I mean, it must be increasingly difficult. I think you did very well getting hold of the old tickets and posters. I mean, are you still managing to collect a few?
Posters, I actually have a problem. I have an addiction to posters, and so I'm always acquiring movie posters and spending far more money than I can really afford to, but it's fun. I'm actually currently working on a book with a UK-based co-author and a UK-based publisher about Thai movie posters. This is in the rough draft stage right now, but due to be out at the end of the year. As far as movie theaters, I was also writing my next book on the movie theaters of Burma.
Well, I was going to say, but Burma would probably be quite a fertile source for finding things like this, because the little time that I've spent in some place like Rangoon, there must be little sources where you can go and get this type of material. It must be just got to stumble across it. That's the challenge.
There's plenty of it, and
yeah, there must be.
And operational movie theaters, very photogenic locations to shoot. So yeah, that was in the works, and then the coup happened, and I decided that it would be best to shelve this project before anything I write become outdated before it's even published.
Yeah, so, no. There are different challenges there as well. But I mean, yeah. But as for actually finding the material, I would say that would be one of the best places to spend a little bit of time. I'm sure you'd unearth some real gems.
Absolutely.
But I found it fascinating, and I think if you hadn't gone around taking these photographs, I mean, many people probably wouldn't even realize that many of those buildings had been cinemas at some point in time. Some of them quite hard to recognize. It's only when you've done a bit of research and you manage to track down the history and take the photographs that you did. And I mean, what you would have thought, and I suppose unfortunately a number of the theatres that you mentioned were sitting on quite valuable real estate. So if you can't use that as a theatre, you can always use that real estate for something else, and that's obviously what's happened to a number of the old theatres.
So the number one problem with old movie theaters is they occupy a large physical footprint, and they're usually in very prime real estate zones.
Precisely, and then so the temptation to sort of realize that into cash, and when you're probably not making any money out of the asset anyway, that's the direction people would move into.
Absolutely.
But, if anybody hasn't got any other questions, I mean, I just say, Phil, thank you very much. I mean, it's really much appreciated that you've taken the time to give us the presentation. And I wish you well with your new ventures and your new books. And if we can have a thank you in person, I'd be delighted. But thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been much appreciated. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. And
thank you.
Do it again sometime.
Yeah. Cheers, Phil. Take care. Thank you very much. And thank your girlfriend for us. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have had such an interesting evening.
I definitely will.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye. Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.